I'm going to, Barb, in the bed, I'm going to read 1 Samuel 1 through 9. I know you put those together. If you can get that or have it ready, I'll get to that in a minute. I've been giving her a manuscript at the back. She gets those things together, and I failed to do that today. I'm just thinking about it, and I'm like, oh, she doesn't know what verses I'm going to read here in a little bit. But it's in the fly. We are coming back to our 52 stories in the Bible that form our faith and practice. And this week, we're going to be looking at this story of how and why a transition of power took place. We're going to be, that power moved from the first king of the tribes of Israel to their second king, who was not a descendant of that first king, which could spell trouble in a lot of societies. Even though God had tried to dissuade the tribes of Israel from uniting into a single nation under the rule of a monarch to start with, he didn't abandon them, even though that's what they chose to do. He was still their God. They were still his people. You know, we were often reminded in the scriptures that God is faithful even when we're not faithful. But that doesn't mean that he will deliver us from the consequences of our own actions or our own choices, as some might say. He has even been shown to sort of help those consequences along. Sometimes he even emphasizes those consequences with us. He's even been known to bring something good as a result of the consequences that we suffer. God is also known for, I'll put it this way, he's known for giving us lots of on-ramps whenever we get off the road so that we can get back on to the right road. You know, God's not a limited access highway. You've been on some of those, you get on and just great, but you can't figure out how to get off, or you're off and you're going like, how do I ever get back on this road? There's no way to get on here. He's not like that. You know, this is summertime, lots of people traveling, lots of people going. Steve just talked about how he and our children took this road trip up to Camp Como in Colorado. And I'm returning from a road trip to Coleman, Texas, where I was the morning Bible teacher this last week at the 56th annual Little George Cowboy Camp meeting that was sponsored by one of our missions that we support, Cowboy Up International Ministries. If you don't know, they are a church planting mission. They are convinced that if they start a new church, they'll have the opportunity to make more disciples for Jesus. And so they're in the business of doing that. And while I was there, I got to hear a lot of conversations from people who were being converted to Christ and their rededications, and some stories of people. I'm going like, wow, that's such an amazing story of where you were off and how God got you back on the right road. So anyways, you know, when you're going on one of these road trips, there are those off-ramps that we need to take every now and then. You know, we need to take off and get gas. We need something to eat. We need to use the facilities. Sometimes we just need a break from driving, just to, you know, stop for just a little bit. But we're always getting back on the road. We're always headed to our final destination, or that destination we have before us. But if you use that sort of spiritually speaking, instead of actual road trip, there are a lot of people who get off the road that we've started on with God, the narrow way, the more difficult way, the less traveled way. And we get off that road and we sometimes just sort of meander around. Sometimes we even get lost when we get off of it and don't even know how to get back to the right road, much less on it. Some people get off and they say, I don't want to be on that road anymore. That was a tough road. Others say, I'm looking for a different road. I just didn't feel like that was the right road for me. I need another road in my life. Something that's wide, something that's easy, something that has a whole lot of people on it. I want to be going where everyone else is on it. You know, I feel that what they need is a good GPS. You know, that's what they need. They need a good and patient shepherd. That's GPS for me, spiritually speaking. A GPS that provides the directions we need for those on-ramps so that we can get back on that right road that's headed to the very best of destinations for us. But even a GPS, even a good and patient shepherd, doesn't do us any good if we won't follow the directions. I don't know how you are when you use yours. Sometimes mind is telling me to go one way and I turn and go another way. And she doesn't give me consequences for my actions, but she does sound an awful lot of noise when I turn left, turn left. You're not going. You need to turn left up here pretty soon somewhere. You know how it is. I think God is trying to get us back on the right way. But sometimes we have to ask ourselves, how many chances is God going to give us? How many times will he show us the way over and over and over that we're just ignoring? How many times will he come to our rescue when we get off track? The answer, of course, is it's up to him. We don't know the number of times he's going to do that, but we do have some assurance in that he is a faithful and patient God. And he's also a God who knows all things, which means that he knows what we are going to do even before we do it. And even though he knows what we are going to choose, he keeps on providing us those opportunities for us to get back on the road. I think the opportunities need to be there for us because from our perspective, we haven't made that choice yet. That opportunity is coming up. Are we going to take it? Are we going to use it? Is this the way we want to do? From our perspective, it's sort of in our choice. But from God's perspective, he knows what we're going to do in advance. And he's providing what we need so that we can come back to him. In a way, it's sort of mysterious, or some people might say mischievous, but he's at work giving us every opportunity. When we hear other people's stories in the Bible, it sometimes seems like they had few choices in the matter. And I'm thinking of Saul in particular. Saul was on a road trip. Saul was on his way to Damascus, a city that was north of Jerusalem, quite a ways north. It was a city that a lot of Christians had moved to because they were trying to get away from persecution. And Paul becomes Paul, but this Saul is going down that road because he wants to go find those people and he wants to teach them that what they have done is wrong by persecuting them and showing them just how bad it was, hoping that they would change. But as he's going on that road, Jesus appears to him in this bright light. It even blinds him. And he changes. He sort of puts on the brakes. He changes his direction. He starts to follow God and listens for God's direction in his life. Of course, we know the rest of the story about this Saul. We know what he chooses. We know that the persecutor becomes the proclaimer of the good news. We know that he stops being known as Saul and becomes known as Paul, the apostle. His faith in Jesus changes him. He begins to believe that this guy that everyone's talking about, Jesus, really did die for the sins of the world. He was resurrected. And now he's starting to try to live for him. When he finally shows back up in Jerusalem, instead of going back to all the people he had been hanging out with, he shows up to be with the other Christians who are gathered there. And they don't know what to do with him. They're not sure if this is just some elaborate trap and he's trying to spoof them. They don't know if it was a real change in his heart or not because they don't know. So people have to stand up and say, yeah, this is the same Saul. He really has changed. And this is how we know what's really in his heart, by looking at the things that he's doing different now than he did before that change. In today's story that we're going to read together, we're going to be reminded that our faith in God always ends up being expressed in our obedience to him, and other people can tell what's in our heart by our behaviors. But unlike the story of the Saul who became Paul, the story that we're going to look at is a tragic story about this other Saul. Actually, it was Saul's namesake. This Saul that was King Saul. It's a story that makes me wonder how things could have been different if King Saul had obeyed God rather than trusting on his own understandings and making choices for himself. But that's not what happens. We don't know the answer to those kinds of questions. Our story begins when King Saul was directed by God to lead his mighty men, his army, against the Amalekites, who had often raided God's people. Their king, King Agag, led the Amalekites in raids against the tribes of Israel. He plundered them, and he didn't just take their things, but he killed them, and he did so in ways that are described as ungodly. He was not an innocent man. He was not leading innocent people. The command of the Lord came to King Saul. But it was not an easy command for him to embrace. He and his mighty men were to go to where the Amalekites lived, and they were to attack them, to punish them for what their king, who they were named for, had done. Now, before King Agag had become king of the Amalekites, there's some history here you need to know. There was a king called Amalek. That's how you get the Amalekites. King Amalek attacked Israel whenever they were coming up out of Egypt. Remember the stories about, they're coming out of Egypt, they're coming up. Well, this king Amalek saw them, and he saw that they were weak. He saw that they were weary. He saw that they were tired, and he began to attack them. He wanted to get rid of them. And the way he started was with the stragglers. They were the ones that were kind of holding back and not keeping up. He would attack them, and he would kill them, and he would take whatever they had. And then he began to attack more and more as he advanced further up. It was King Amalek and his atrocities that got God to have Moses turn and defend themselves. You remember the story that time whenever Moses had to hold up his staff, and as long as he held it up, the Israelites won, but whenever he dropped it down, the other side, well, that was a battle with King Amalek, who was coming against them. That's where that story is found. King Amalek showed no mercy to those that he came across. He was bloodthirsty. It was against the Amalekites that Moses had to defend themselves. You remember the prophet Balaam? Later on in history, there was the Balaam that we usually think of the story about the talking donkey and all that kind of stuff. But whenever Balaam did prophesy in his 5th prophecy, he prophesied that King Amalek and his people would receive the consequences for their actions, and they would be utterly destroyed. That day had finally come. And God was going to have King Saul be the one who brought that annihilation. The command that King Saul was given was to go where the Amalekites were, and he was to kill every person. He was to show no mercy, just as they had shown no mercy. He was even to kill all of their livestock. It was, again, one of those scorched earth policies that we sort of repel from. This is very similar to the same command that Joshua received in regard to the city of Jericho that we studied earlier. It is consistent in how God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah for their ungodliness. I'm glad that I'm living in a time that we're commanded by God to go to all nations and make more and better disciples by baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to obey all the commands of Christ. I like that we can sum up our mission as saying that we're trying to get people to love God and to love one another as they love themselves. I like that commission. That's not the kind of commission that King Saul received in regard to his enemies. We're told to love our enemies. But King Saul said, you need to go and you need to be one who brings about the consequences for their actions. Instead of following God's command, King Saul did several things using his own wisdom. The first thing he did was he sent warning to the Kenites. Now, the Kenites was a particular family of the tribes of the Amalekites, and they were the only family of the Amalekites that didn't join in the attacks against Israel when they were coming up out of Egypt. He sent word to them so that they could gather their family and get out of the way so that they wouldn't be killed. He didn't want them to be destroyed. King Saul also decided that it would be a good idea if they captured the Amalekite king Agag, and they used him sort of as a bargaining chip. So they arrested him instead of killing him. And King Saul's men, under King Saul's direction, took the very best of the Amalekites' livestock. And of course, they were sort of taking it as the plunder of war for themselves, payment for what they were doing. Now, the rest of the Amalekites, they did as God directed. They killed them. But God wasn't pleased with King Saul's lack of obedience. Perhaps you recall the story that we studied not long ago whenever God commanded Abraham to do something that Abraham didn't want to do. You remember the story that we studied about Abraham being told he's to sacrifice his son, to kill his son as a sacrifice to God? I can't imagine any father wanting to do that. Abraham didn't like it, but he obeyed it. And what he did was accredited to him as righteousness. It was seen as a demonstration of his trust, his faith in God, that he wasn't willing to hold back his only son from God. You want me to do what, God? Okay. I'm going to trust you. I'm going to do what you want me to do. Now, we love the story of his obedience because at the very last minute, God intervenes and changes the story. He doesn't end up killing his son, but he's stayed when he's at that last moment, and a sacrifice is provided, a substitution for his son. The ram gets put on the altar and is sacrificed in his place, and it becomes a foreshadowing of what Jesus does for us, the Son of God, who dies for the sins of the world. We don't know what would have happened had Abraham acted like King Saul. If Abraham would have decided for himself what was the right thing to do instead of carrying out God's command to him. But we only know what happened because of his faithfulness. Our stories can have two endings as well, by what we might do out of faith and trust in God, or what we might do whenever we decide what we are going to do. Similarly, we don't know what would have happened to King Saul had he obeyed God and wiped them out, because we find out through this story what was really in his heart. In his heart of hearts, he didn't trust God. He wasn't willing to obey him completely. Which is why Samuel, the prophet, was sent by God to confront King Saul after his disobedience. Samuel was not delighted in what he had to do. He didn't want to be the one to go to King Saul and say, hey, King, what you did was wrong, and now there are consequences for your actions, because Samuel had been the one that had set him apart. Samuel had been the one who had anointed. Samuel was really pulling for him. And he hated to be the messenger to say, hey, King Saul, you screwed up. When Samuel pointed out that King Saul had disobeyed God, first thing King Saul does is deny it. I didn't do anything wrong. Samuel has to say, well, then what's all that bleating I hear? Oh, you mean those sheep, those Amalekites? Oh, we're going to be taking all of those as a sacrifice to God. Well, what about King Agag? We're going to be taking care of him. Part of the story we don't tell is that Samuel ends up killing King Agag in front of everyone because he's carrying out what God had commanded. People who get caught in a lie, even a lie in regard to obeying God, try to get out of it by lying their way out of it. But it never works. You can't cover up your disobedience. God knows what's in your heart. Samuel told King Saul that the Lord did not delight in the kinds of sacrifices that he said he was going to do. Oh, I'm going to take all those sheep and I'm going to make sacrifices to you. That's what I'm going to do. We often quote that God desires obedience more than sacrifices, but we don't talk about the story that the obedience was killing all the Amalekites. And the obedience was killing all of those sheep whenever God told them to do it. It is disconcerting to me in this story when you read it that King Saul finally admits that what he did was wrong. He says, you're right. I disobeyed God. I had my own purposes. I had my own plans. I was thinking about myself. Samuel, can you just speak to the Lord and ask for him to forgive me? And Samuel says, no, I can't. He asked several times, and Samuel has to tell him each time, no, I can't. You see, God has already given me a message that I have to give you, and I can't change the message. The message I have to give you is that because you have turned away from God, God is going to turn away from you. And I have to give you that message. And Samuel was tore up about it. It's not what he wanted to do. It's not the message he wanted to deliver. But it is the one that God had him deliver. And God began to work out his punishment in Samuel's life. In Saul's life. After he gave the message, Samuel was depressed about it. He grieved over the fact that King Saul's life was going to be completely changed, and he didn't know what was going to happen next. And that's where today's story really begins, but you need to know the context so that you hear the words right. So if you have your Bible, turn to chapter 16 of Samuel. We're going to read the first 9 verses of it together. I'll be reading from the New American Standard with you. I think that's what's going to be here. It is. Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite. For I have selected a king for myself among his sons. But Samuel said, how can I go? When Saul hears of it, he will kill me. And the Lord said, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord, and you shall invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you what you shall do, and you shall anoint for me the one whom I designate to you. So Samuel did what the Lord said and came to Bethlehem. And the elders of the city came trembling to meet him and said, do you come in peace? Now I'm going to pause there just for a second. You remember that Samuel was the last judge of Israel, and he often led military battles. And so when he showed up, it wasn't always a good thing now, even though they were under a kingly system. And so if you see God's servant coming up, you might be like, okay, why are you here? Are we under judgment? He's like, no, in peace. I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Consecrate yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. He also consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. When they entered, he looked at Eli and thought, surely the Lord's anointed is before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God sees not as a man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel, and he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Next, Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Then we get to the part that we read earlier in our service together. I'm not going to read that again. We know which one the Lord chose. It was the least of Jesse's sons. When we share the story of David being chosen, we always emphasize that God does not look at the appearance of a man, but what is in his heart. Wouldn't you like to have that superpower to be able to know what's in someone's heart, what's really there? We can't do what God can do. But Jesus did say some things that give us a clue about a person. It was Jesus who said, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. You can tell a lot by what people say. He also said in the parable of the last day, recorded in Matthew 18, that the sheep will be separated from the goats. The sheep and the goats all call him Lord, but the one who sits on the throne is going to separate them, and it's going to be by what they do. So not only our words reveal what's in our heart, but what we end up doing in regard to following Jesus' commands. The ones that would be separated out for heaven were the ones who really had faith in God, evidenced by their compassion, evidenced by their acts of love. They fed people, they gave them something to drink when they didn't have drink, they clothed them, they visited in prison. In fact, Jesus says, hey, whenever I was thirsty, when I was without clothes, when I was out without food, when I was in prison, you did these things to me when you do them to the least of these. There's something that reveals our heart whenever we see someone who has a need and we're so bothered by it that we have to do something. You see, that tells us what's in your heart. Your words, but your actions. And they have to go together. Look at how a person, I was told, you want to know what is really in a person's heart? Just look how they spend their money. That'll tell you what's in their heart. Look at their schedule. How are they spending their time? That'll tell you what's in their heart. Look at what they give their attention to, their energy on. And you're going to start seeing what's in a person's heart. Now, there are times when we want to cover it up, and it's sometimes difficult to know, especially if we don't live life together, because we just see each other, how's it going, it's nice. We can cover up a whole lot of things that people don't see because they're not around us. But as we begin living life together, man, you start knowing what's in a person's heart. You want to know what's in the heart of a mom or a dad? Look at their kids. They're living with them all the time, and they'll tell you. And sometimes, maybe when they shouldn't tell you, exactly what are in their parents' hearts. In the early church, it was difficult to tell what was in a person's heart. And the Apostle John said, okay, you guys, try this. If a person says that Jesus came in the flesh, and he died, and he was risen from the dead, that's a person that tells us that there's someone who's following Jesus. Now, that was an addition to saying, look at their lives, and are they loving like the people that God loves? In fact, John would even go back to that, saying, are they a person who sees someone in need and does something to help them? Because that reveals that their heart is one like God's. It evidences that we're having a hard time sorting out what's really in a person's heart whenever we're trying to analyze them a lot. But I want you to know it's not our job to do that. It's God's job to do that. It's our job to love. It's our job to embrace. It's our job to offer forgiveness. It's our job to extend to the people around us mercy and grace. It's God's job in the area of judgment. Now, we're often called on with one another to hold each other accountable so that we can continue to find those on-ramps in following God. So when we get to this story about King Saul as adults, I think it's important for us to notice that King Saul was completely aware that God had already chosen his replacement. King Saul knew that he was in trouble with God. He knew that God was withdrawing from him, but he didn't know that his replacement had already been chosen. When I read through that, I'm like, you know what? There's not one of us who can't get replaced. And God, if we need to be replaced, God is already at work at it. He didn't know that David had been anointed the next king in Bethlehem. In fact, few people really did. But God was at work raising up a leader who was led by his Spirit. And he brings David in connection with King Saul in a very, what I think is an unusual way. When you skip to the rest of the story in the rest of chapter 16, I'm not going to read it with you, but I'm going to summarize it with you because I'm getting late here. It tells us that God's Spirit, whenever David receives God's Spirit leaves King Saul. And in place of God's Spirit, an evil spirit from God is given to Saul. This is one of the only times in the Bible I can find where God gives someone an evil spirit. Usually that's Satan's work, right? But we're told that God gives him An evil spirit that torments him. Why? Well, we're told the answer. King Saul is told by his servants that the only way he can find relief from this being tormented by this evil spirit, is if someone plays the harp. And if someone plays the harp, then he is going to find relief from that evil spirit. What do you think King Saul's first action is? Where's a harpist? We need to get one of those guys, and he needs to be present all the time. You guys that are mine, you go find me a harpist. And one of the men said, hey, there's this guy named David who is a really good harpist, and, we should get him. And King Saul's like, make it so, number one. Go get that guy. And so he shows up. We're told that not only was David, who will be king, a skillful musician, but it says that he was a mighty man of valor. It says that he is a warrior, that he's one who is prudent in speech, and that he is a handsome man. And we know all those statues of David, right? They don't make an ugly guy. But the most important quality, and this is in 1 Samuel 16:18, is that the Lord is with him. The Lord is with him. God may not look on the outside, but others often do. And they see in David all the kinds of qualities that we would look for in a leader. I find it intriguing that when David shows up, he doesn't disclose to King Saul that, hey, God has already picked me to replace you. I have God's Spirit and you don't. Nah. There's some humility in his life. When David shows up, he kind of acts like one of God's people. He sees the needs of King Saul. He comforts King Saul. He serves King Saul. He starts out as this person who sees the needs of King Saul's and does what he can to meet them. Sounds like a godly kind of person, led by God's Spirit kind of person. He is even made and rewarded for that to become King Saul's arm bearer. I think one of the lessons we need to learn from the story is that when we express our faith, it gets expressed in obedience to the commands of Christ. And even in the Old Testament, as it is today, when we do that, it looks a lot like love. God will be at work guiding our steps. And I think the work of love is whenever we find those on-ramps that He's opened for us so that we can be God's person in the place where God wants us so that we can do what He needs done. And there are opportunities for us. God put together an amazing orchestration to get David where he needed to be to do the work that God wanted him to do. And I think God is working that way in your life too. I think God is opening up some on-ramps into people's lives that you need to go through so that you can be God's person in the right place at the right time, expressing God's love to them, regardless of their response to it. You see, our mission is to go. It might be going to your family. It might be going to someone who doesn't have God's Spirit. It might be going somewhere far away, but it's going to be going and being just who you are around here. A person who loves God and loves their neighbor. And when we do so, that ends up making disciples. Because we share the good news of why we are that kind of a person. And we want others to be that kind of a person too. I'm going to ask the worship team if they'll make their way up. It's important for us to recognize that God really is at work in our lives. If you turn away from Him, don't be surprised. If He turns away from you, He'll still work through you and bring about good. But I want you to begin to envision what God is going to do with you when you stay obedient to Him, when your faith is expressed in the differences in the lives of people that you can make through that faithful obedience. If there's a next step that you need to make, we want to invite you to make that or get together with us and make it. Steve and I were talking, and one of the challenges that our young people had up at Camp Como was their sort of first step with God, of taking their hearing and believing through those steps of repentance and confession and baptism. And if you're at a point where that's where you're at, we want to get with you and encourage you and help you take those steps. But you may have made those steps a long time ago, and maybe it's those next steps of how am I to be faithful today? Who is around me that God is leading me to? What are some of those people that God wants my life intertwined with so that I can show His love to them? Hope that God is moving you for decision and that you come to that place as we stand and sing together.